Hey folks, for the Skautfold fans in the audience, your day has come, since I recently ran through Pugware's Night's End, the finale in their long-running Eldritch horror series, and perhaps the most markedly different from its predecessor, given the transition from Metroidvania to turn-based RPG. Though, it's not the first time the genre's changed. Still, it does beg the question. Was this finale worth waiting for, or did Night's End make for a Skautfold outcome? Boo! I'm your host, Arlian. Let's find out together. Night's End is a bit difficult to summarize, partly because it's built around the lore the last 4 games have established. That said, a broad description of the setting is provided with its intro. Namely, the world is on the verge of annihilation due to a nascent godling, read the friggin' moon, which is in the process of waking up. In order to avoid extinction, humanity is currently in the process of speedrunning the construction of a Eldritch spacecraft. An arc that needs series staple Waltum to pilot it, which would be fine were he not currently infesting the love interest of our protagonist Len. Suffice to say, this situation is uncomfortable enough that Waltum's able to talk her into journeying to one of his factories in order to infiltrate a certain secret lab and procure him a new body to inhabit. Simple, right? Well, beyond all the experiments running amok, all of which are less than happy about being trapped within the premises. Now, given that this particular episode is largely focused on the facility, it's fairly easy to pick up even for a relative newcomer to the series. In fact, even when the game makes callbacks towards earlier games, there's usually enough fragmented exposition that it's pretty simple to piece together the broad strokes, even if certain bits of nuance might not hit as hard. Partly, this is due to the way the story is presented, since the bulk of this game's narrative is told through interactable points, serving to provide insight into Len's thoughts on the situation and her surroundings. Also, those aforementioned bits of exposition. There's also a few NPCs you can talk to at the hub whose dialogue changes every so often as you progress the main story. While this was sort of nice, it's a bit difficult to tell when they'll have something new to say to you, since you're never given any real contextual clues for when new dialogue drops, which can lead to rereading chunks of dialogue. Oh, and speaking of reading dialogue, those interactable lore points I mentioned earlier, the game doesn't actually pause when you're glancing at them, so if you're proximal to an enemy, you can expect to get ambushed mid-read. With that said, now's as good a time as any to get into the subject of the gameplay itself, and it's weird. Like, at a glance, the game is certainly an RPG, but the way it plays out is a curious combination of rock, paper, scissors and QTE inputs, which is definitely a sentence. And may have resulted in me getting absolutely curb stomped for the first couple of fights until I decided to actually read through the combat instructions. Because, well, Len is fragile. Much like its predecessors in the Skautfold series, the guard bar system is at play once again. The guard meter is essentially an auxiliary health bar that regenerates over time, and which serves as a nice bulwark between the enemy and your actual vitality. While this might sound forgiving at first, it should be noted that it also doubles as your stamina whenever you make an attack, so it's very easy to burn through the entirety of your defenses if you're not careful, especially early on. And that's deadly, since not only do enemies frequently do enough damage to just outright kill Len when she has no guard, any damage that does punch through to her health will reduce her max guard proportionate to her current health. I.e., once things start to go wrong, it's more than likely they'll continue to spiral. Especially since health, unlike guard, doesn't replenish itself when you're out of a fight. While this might not sound horrible, it should be noted that your only real means of healing hinges on finding a path to the game's hub, at which point you'll heal to full, or the use of Vitae injectors, which is a healing item that provides a heap of restoration. Only, you can't use items out of combat, so it's entirely possible to find yourself stuck at the verge of death, with the only thing really standing between you and obliteration being whether or not you ambushed an enemy and gave yourself enough wiggle room on the active time bar to get a turn and then actually execute using the item. Well, that or defending, which I was pretty bad at initially because I was doing it wrong like a yutz. Using a magic shield to block magic, dodging bullets, blocking a sword swing? When I was poking into this blind, these sounded like the correct choices to me, but matching an incoming attack with a defense sharing the same attribute will only have the damage, leading to a slow death by attrition, especially if you bump into several fights back to back. Only by matching the correct defense type, such as a melee block to a magic attack, do you really stand a chance of surviving a protracted series of encounters. And that's because not only does it enable you to block twice as much damage as a normal block, and thus potentially perfect guard your way through, it also restores a chunk of stamina to you, which can let you recover from, say, picking the wrong defense and eating the entirety of an attack to the face. There's no QTE there, you just get mulched. Here's the thing though, once you get into the swing of things, you'll discover that a portion of this is more of a formality than anything, and that's because the game pauses when you're choosing your defense. As long as a number of attacks aren't going off simultaneously and you've jumbled up on which one you're reacting to, which I've done, you're able to choose the optimal choice just about every time, which makes this more a matter of how good you are at QTE timing than anything else. Like, yes, there is technically a fourth type of defense in the form of parries, which lets you reflect a chunk of damage you take back at your enemies, but it suffers in the defense department and lacks the restoration of an optimal defense choice, which means late game enemies are all but guaranteed to guard crush you into oblivion, especially when you get to the bonus bosses who'll pop you like a zit if you guard for anything less than 80%. No, where the real strategic elements kick in is your offensive options. Like, yes, it's entirely possible to get through the bulk of the game just by exploiting an enemy's weakness with the right weapon, doubly so if you're good at inputting the obligatory QTE to do maximum damage. Small shout out to Melee for having the easiest to execute. That said, you would be missing out on the bulk of what Night's End has to offer insofar as its combat. See, every weapon in the game, including the initial trio you're allotted, has a given quirk, with the bulk of these being status effects. Your Scythe, for instance, can apply Doom to a target, killing them after 30 seconds of active time has passed, which is never really going to happen to anything that's actually vulnerable to it. Your pistol, on the other hand, can weaken an enemy's offense, and your spellbook amplifies the health damage they take. And it's not long at all until you stumble across a shotgun whose effect is that it increases the amount of time it takes for an enemy to get their turn. They're potent effects which can shift the tide of a battle, often to the point where it feels worthwhile to try and stick them onto an enemy even when they aren't necessarily vulnerable. It's a little tricky on resistant enemies since it seems to work a quarter of the time versus the baseline coin toss and the outright guarantee of an optimal attack in QTE. Still, when you have an enemy that's self-healing to an obscene degree, having a weapon that disables any and all forms of regeneration will feel like an outright godsend. Frankly, the weapons were a major reason that I found myself exploring the game as thoroughly as I did, since a great deal of them are entirely optional and, well, that'd be a shame to actually pass up. The late game synergies that crop up are when things go from interesting to outright awesome, because you'll eventually get weapons that allow you to forcibly swap an enemy's weaknesses around, allowing you to set them up for statuses they might otherwise resist, or weapon combinations that hit especially hard, like the rapier and the spear, which deals double damage if an enemy is afflicted by the rapier's pierce status. There's also the katana nonsense, which just auto-kills an enemy afflicted by doom. Like, yes, there's enemies that resist certain statuses, so you can't solve all trash battles that way, but you can solve a lot. And what it can't solve, well, that's what focus attacks are for. See, as you successfully complete defense and offensive QTEs, you'll gradually generate focus points, which allow you to execute hard-hitting attacks associated with one of the three weapon types. Now, off the bat, these actually aren't all that impressive compared to your other options. What makes them good is the fact they'll continue to scale as you acquire more focus, leading up to some absolutely surreal damage numbers if you hoard enough focus during a prolonged fight. Such as this fucker who regenerates and resists the anti-regen status. But yeah, that's the crux of the combat. There is a bit more nuance to be found with the items, which you can helpfully purchase at the shop, but thanks to my flagrant abuse of the ancient coin item, which triples EXP and money drops from the combat encounters, including boss fights, I never really had to pay attention to the economy in any sort of meaningful way, allowing me the liberty to experiment with items and fiddle a bit more freely with the leveling system, which... Okay, so when you level up, you have the choice between 4 different stats, 3 of which are used to amplify the damage of certain attacks by 2%. Which could be nice if you went all in on one, but given the way that enemy resistances work, your inability to swap them around till late game, and the simple fact that some will resist your attempts to do so anyways, I just decided to boost guard. So much. The ability to have extra wiggle room for errors and be able to attack more freely before I'm even at risk of having my health pool dented was priceless. It also meant that I didn't get outright one-shotted by certain late-game bosses if I didn't perfect block shots. The healing items were really nice now since they heal by a percentage, and it was just nice to actually have better heals from the healing items since they heal by percentage. Also, I just really didn't want to die, though not because of any sort of unforgiving death mechanic. To be quite honest, you don't actually lose anything from dying unless you choose to revive in the room that killed you, which never really felt worth 30% of my resources. No, the reason dying hurt was because enemy encounters aren't random. Rather, they exist as roaming mobs on the map, and it's entirely possible to purge them from existence in order to reduce the facility into a desolate wasteland that's easy to navigate. I mean, sure, doing so enough will eventually garner the attention of the optional hunter boss, but as long as you're on top of the combat system, he's just an ideal opportunity to spend an ancient coin. I am not sorry, Pug. Alternatively, if you're not inclined to engage in a never-ending brawl with everyone and their second cousin, you can use the out-of-combat scythe swing. While it's largely used to lock an enemy down so you can start a fight without being ambushed, late game I wound up largely using it to paralyze enemies so I could just scoot by them, because things were tanky and if they weren't fragile or katanaable, I wasn't having it. Especially given how winding and labyrinthine some of the segments are, there are just parts that wound up feeling long, and I cannot emphasize how much of a relief it was when I found a shortcut that connected things to an earlier area, or even better, a portal to the hub that gave me a permanent fast travel point. Especially when the game started to deliberately mess with me, such as the final portion of the facility, which that was really where I started to skip fights and just never stopped because I got sick and tired of being looped back to the start of that segment. And I think some of the fault rests on its aesthetic, namely its visuals. Don't get me wrong, I think there's some lovely bit of design in the game, with solid enemies to encounter, and it was neat that all the weapons had their own animations. That said, there's a certain degree of sameness that will start to set in with a lot of the environments. While some of it was no doubt intentional in order to mess with the player and their sense of direction, it does get a bit tedious, especially if you stick with the game, and it led me to just wanting to be done with areas. Especially when a certain gimmick led me to cycling through the same series of rooms over and over again, largely because of my desire to explore and see all of the lore / get all the items. Though a couple times were rooted in me picking fights and getting sloppy at the tail end of my playthrough. Yeah. It's a lot, really. Admittedly, I don't have anywhere near as much to poke at on the audio side of things. Whether it's the battle music or the ambient music, things generally sound good, with the only bit of weirdness coming from a bug where the two overlapped to make a horrendous cacophony. Notably, this happened a bunch in the underground, but if you folks also happen to encounter it in a different area, let me know in the comments what location it happened to you, since Pug has checked these videos before and is generally pretty good about patching things. But with all that said, let's boil this down, shall we? At the end of the day, Night's End is an interesting but somewhat flawed experience. On a narrative front, it was cathartic to finally reach the end of the Skautfold saga. On the facility side of things, it's a relatively neat romp with its own twists and turns. But it does lack a lot of the drama and suspense of its predecessors for a large part of the experience, given that the bulk of the journey is essentially tying up loose ends. It does build up momentum near the tail end of the experience, but again, once you get to the finale, the way it pans out might leave newcomers feeling a little bit lost, but if you've been here from the start, it works. Really though, where things started to unravel for me was the gameplay. Having spent some 10 odd hours plunging through its myriad corridors, I ultimately came away with a certain sense of tedium. You can, unironically, get through the majority of the game's fights ignoring all but the most bare bone of mechanics, as the vast majority of enemies don't really force you to change up the way you fight or influence things in a unique way. In fact, the biggest and most interesting challenges I encountered were the 2 bonus bosses squirreled away on the side path because they both forced me to drastically change how I approached those fights. Otherwise, the decision to swap was largely based around the desire to expedite encounters rather than any real form of necessity. And given how much combat is in the game, that's sort of depressing. Like, yes, I could have bypassed a bunch of fights, but that's also how you get ambushed if you let your guard down. Also, I really did want to see what the game had to offer in its fights. As for the exploration elements, I did enjoy wandering around to soak in lore and acquire items, but the experience feels like a step back as compared to its predecessor, Moonless Night, which again had some Metroidvania elements baked into the experience. Instead, I just found myself meandering through hallways. So many hallways. Ultimately, while the game certainly introduced a number of interesting mechanics, they didn't feel like they were used to their fullest potential, and I instead just found myself cycling through the same sort of QTEs over and over and over. So, although I do have a soft spot for the series, and I do think there is a degree of merit in playing through this episode, it's definitely a solid example of a fumble. P.S. What's the deal with the Eldritch stat? It's just sitting there at 0 forever. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Shrimp Mania, Green Witch Babby, and Andy Noted. And an extra big thank you to Daisy for the one-time donation to the Fumble and Yzma Food Fund. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs bearing a little fumble, and shirts. That said, I'll catch y'all in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.